Aeneg by Cáel. Chapter 14. Jana smiled up at the stars from the wing of her jet, and Maayish smiled at her. Watching the women watching the astral bodies always made him smile. She had been there since the beginning, before the first had found them and taught them how to defend themselves. She had bigger balls than he at the time. She had been one of the first to take a blade to her skin and leap into the fray when the Memphs had finally torn down the gates to the university they had been holed up in. He'd followed her into battle that day, and he never looked back. It didn't really matter anymore, what they used to be, though little parts of their old selves still showed through every now and then, especially on nights like tonight. The woman had been a lecturing astrophysicist, and the only reason they had been trapped together when the outbreak hit was because he'd been selling weed to some students in her building. But none of it mattered now. In this time, they were scouts, warriors of the current age and soldiers at a war with an enemy that didn't care about skin color, culture, or religion. She was a Valkyrie, and he knew he would live through every battle fought with her, because he was in love with her. "Are you going to stand there all night, or are you going to join me?" Jana hummed invitingly, breaking Maayish from his admiration of how the moonlight softly highlighted the corners of her face. He chuckled and sauntered over, hefting himself up to lie beside her and slip an arm under her head when she lifted it. "You see that bright star?" she asked, pointing up at the sky. She didn't wait for his reply before she continued. "That's the Swift-Tuttle comet. It only comes by every 120 years. "A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity?" he asked softly, though his gaze never left her face. "Good thing we didn't miss it." "You aren't even looking at it," she scoffed, reaching up to smack his hand lightly. "One of the most beautiful sights the heavens have to offer, and you're missing it." "Why look at the heavens when true beauty is right here beside me?" he hummed through a smirk. She turned to stare at him, and then she broke down into fits of giggles when he waggled his eyebrows at her. Maayish loved her laugh. Sappy and cheesy and romantic as it was, he loved that sound, and he couldn't stop the mirrored effect it had on him. "You, Maayish Kutsia, are so full of cuck," Jana giggled. "Oh," he gasped, melodramatically miming a projectile to his heart. "That's so cold, Jana," he mourned, before tugging the woman into a kiss, pulled too tight by laughter. It was perfect. Her giggles slowly faded when he didn't let up, and she turned into the embrace to reciprocate. When he finally pulled away, she looked up at him and promptly forgot about her stars. She called him smooth in a low, inviting murmur, and his free hand traveled down her side, only to stop at her hip when a soft voice called out to them, "Maayish, I need your help." The Capetonian groaned and rolled over to reprimand the bastard who interrupted them. A perfectly witty and dismissive phrase already leaving his lips, but it died on his tongue when he saw his no longer apprentice. Silas stood still as a statue, eyes averted and fists clenched tightly. His gauntlet whirled, but he was trying to keep it under control. "Can't it wait?" the colored man finally settled on. "I'm kind of in the middle of something." "No." Silas shook his head vehemently, his insistence just this side of too loud in the otherwise empty hangar. "No, it can't." Maayish groaned irritably, but was pushed up by his lover. "Oh, go on then," Jana chuckled. "I'll bet Cáel has something to do with it." The man snorted but leveled a smirk at her. "The usual wager?" "Duh," she chuckled, and smacked his butt as he hopped off the wing to trot over to the blonde. Silas said nothing as he quickly led the older man towards the tower. Maayish hadn't gone through there when he'd come up. The place was a wreck, and they had to duck under construction tape when the elevator doors opened. What the hell happened here? Silas actually growled. He wouldn't say. But it isn't hard to guess, the kid spat, taking his mentor off guard. He'd never seen the blonde so angry before. "I just marked it off and got you like he asked." Maayish didn't push, because the kid's hands were balled into fists at his side and shaking. He just followed the blonde down to the field, into a familiar, tooth-covered tent. The man felt his own face contort through a myriad of emotions when he saw the state of the small text sitting in the pile of blankets that constituted a bed. Maayish instantly moved to Dylan's side and pulled the bloody rag away from his face to further inspect the damage. Holy shit, the kid was missing teeth. He glanced worriedly back at Silas, but the blonde wasn't looking at them. He was seething between them and the entrance flaps, barely holding his own anger in check. Maayish turned his attention back to Dylan, but he was sure his face looked anything but calm. What the actual fuck? It's not as bad as it looks, Dylan assured, even though his voice sounded raw and weak and did absolutely nothing to ease the Cape Tonian's nerves. I need a favor. Chapter 15. The sound of his name was what finally brought Cáel back to the land of the functional. Functional being a strong word. Somehow he knew that the very fact he'd woken up meant that he must be a nymph. That was what happened when someone got bitten. Either they died or they turned. Neither Doc nor Marcus had been able to determine why some people died while others became the very thing they had all feared. Cáel only had to see one transformation before, in the moment, he decided to simply decapitate anything breathing, human or nymph, it didn't matter. Once bitten, he couldn't take the risk. It sucked that the bastard who had done this to him hadn't even had the same common courtesy.
Cáel, goddammit, you asshole, wake up!
Dylan's voice was screaming, and it took a moment to realize that the tech's voice was coming through over his comm. He must not have taken it off when... Wait, why was he still screaming? Your voice is annoying, Cáel drawled, and his own voice sounded too loud in his own ears. His head felt like it was about to split in two. The pounding behind his eyes wasn't helping.
You asshole!
Dylan shouted. Cáel could hear the hiccup in his voice. The kid was obviously crying. He could be such a wimp sometimes. The scout instantly felt his stomach lurch at the memory of the tech. Hidden and unconscious, in his bed, swam before his mind's eye.
I thought you were dead.
The voice had gone a little quieter, but it was still shrill, and Cáel vaguely heard the murmur of other voices with him, but he couldn't figure out what they were saying. Disappointed? He joked, as he pulled himself up to sit, and the room spun.
Not as much as I should be,
Dylan scolded, but the relief in his tone gave him away.
What happened?
I don't know, the scout responded. He felt normal enough. No overwhelming desire for human flesh. Even his hands looked normal when he brought them up to his face for inspection. He saw more than 10 fingers, but they were indeed fingers, not claws. He touched the side of his neck and his hand came away bloody. He was reminded of the old cartoons where the pain suddenly throbbed to life.
What do you mean you don't know?
Dylan snapped.
You casually assault me and then just bugger off with a jet? Where the hell are you, Cáel?
Some suburb. The scout swallowed thickly, past the bile rising in his throat. The tracker in the jet should...
It isn't on.
The tech interrupted him curtly.
Which suburb?
Cáel hadn't exactly been paying attention to street signs. A golf estate, he finally answered. Things were slowly starting to cease moving on their own, and his arms were clawed to hell. I didn't fly for more than 15 minutes. I was in a fight with a few... Who are you talking to? The voice wasn't Dylan's. Cáel's head snapped in the direction of the unknown voice. Nausea rushed over him at the movement, and his bracer hummed oddly. It must have been damaged at some point. Probably when the nymph had... There was no nymph now, only a man, sitting not a few meters from the confused scout. Nude as a babe, hair dirty and scraggled, precariously crouched behind the leg of a large overturned table, covered in dried blood and dirt. Cáel froze and slowly spoke to Dylan. I think I found a survivor.
Really?
The tech asked, the relieved quiver in his voice replaced with the usual tone he took when the scouts went out on missions. Yeah, Cáel confirmed hesitantly. I mean, I'm looking at one.
Where are you?
The virtual voice questioned, slower this time, an urgency to it that the tech didn't have before. I don't freaking know. Don't you have that tracker thing? The man shouted back, and the survivors quickly scurried away to the opposite side of the room, clearly afraid but unwilling to leave entirely just yet. There was a long silence on the comms.
You didn't turn it on when you left,
Dylan told him slowly.
Cáel, do you have a headache?
Splitting, the scout confirmed.
Double vision?
Dylan asked. Kind of? Cáel nodded, then stopped quickly. It's coming and going.
How's your balance?
The tech pushed. I don't know, Cáel grumbled. I'm sitting down.
Well, you had better get your ass up quickly, but slowly.
Dylan started, talking quickly, and it kind of hurt his ears.
I think I found you, but I'm hoping I'm wrong.
Why is that? Cáel choked as he pulled himself to stand. Yeah, he had to catch himself on the wall when his vision tilted violently, only to wince as his ribs protested. He felt like he'd been run over by a train. The survivor stood quickly, half hiding behind the frame of the doorway, muttering softly under his breath.
There's a really big group of mems coming your way.
He could hear the fear suddenly rising in the tech's voice. He shushed the survivor before asking, How big?
Very.
Dylan answered.
Numbers won't mean anything to you right now. You're concussed.
Oh, that sucks, the scout groaned. I can't fight or fly with a concussion.
Then you need to hide.
The tech interrupted.
You have about 10 minutes before they get there.
So you do still care. Cáel chuckled, not taking his eyes off the survivor. Surprisingly, the only thing in the room not spinning at that moment.
I'll care less if you don't make it back,
Dylan quipped.
You owe me a face-to-face apology.
Yeah, I know, Cáel hummed, slowly taking his hand off the wall and holding up both to the survivor, like he'd seen Maayish do on occasion with the particularly jumpy ones. I'm coming. The man looked at him like he was the one who should be feared. His grey eyes looked strangely big, surrounded by the dark circles around them. They were wide, and every muscle in his scrawny body was tense to run at the slightest provocation. I'm not going to hurt you, Cáel began. I'm here to help. You have a name? Max, the survivor whispered back after a moment of deliberation. His voice was rough, like he'd forgotten how to use his tongue. Well, Max, we need to get out of here. Cáel tried to sound friendly, but by the man's reaction, he assumed he was getting it wrong. The fact that he was still covered in dirt from his encounter with the gigantic Memph that morning probably didn't help his case. There are Memphs coming. You said you have a jet, the survivor murmured, shifting uncomfortably behind the wall. I also have a Cáel began, but was interrupted. Blueberries can help with that, Max told him, hopefully, his voice rising at the suggestion. There are a lot outside. Not fast enough to make a difference, the scout replied, deliberately not shaking his head, because passing out now would be a decidedly bad idea. He didn't mention that the thought alone, or putting anything in his mouth then, made his stomach flip over violently. We need to hide. The monsters are coming. A lot of them. The survivor nodded. Yes, I can hear them. Cáel strained his ears but couldn't hear anything. It took so much focus, he didn't notice the survivor moving until he blinked and Max was gone. Max? He called out. moving as quickly as he could on unsteady feet. Where the hell did he go?
You lost a survivor?
Silas's voice came through over the comms.
Typical.
Maayish joined in. Neither sounded happy. Oh, shut up, Cáel grumbled, stumbling through the house until he caught sight of the survivor in the garden. What are you two doing on here anyway?
I sent them to pick you up,
Dylan confessed, and Cáel could practically see him standing in front of one of his screens up in the tower, observing the situation. Cáel chuckled deliriously as he leaned heavily on the door jamb and watched the survivor plucking blueberries into an upturned frisbee. I thought you'd send your brother. Dylan scoffed.
No point in wasting resources on a dead man.
So sweet, Cáel commented. Who are you talking to? Max finally cracked, turning to walk cautiously back to the scout with his haul. Are you crazy? The team obviously heard, because they cracked up, Maayish's laughter bursting through the man's skull and shifting his headache dangerously close to migraine territory. Cáel glared at the man. I could just leave you here. Max dropped the fruit and attached himself to the scout's arm, a pathetic whimper accompanying the movement. It was so sudden, Cáel's blade shot out of his bracer and would have stuck the guy right through if he hadn't gone for his unweaponized arm.
Get out streetside. You need to make yourself known, Cáel,
Dylan ordered over the comms.
They're only going to have a few minutes to get you out of there before the mavs swarm the place. Maayish is going to be flying you back, and Silas can take your survivor.
I'm not a bloody damsel in distress, Cáel spat, even as he leaned heavily on Max, and he tugged them back into the house and began looking for the front door. I can fly my own damn plane.
I've been calling you for over an hour,
Dylan chided. He sounded exasperated.
Even Damien doesn't have that much patience. You were unconscious.
Or I turned the volume down, the scout grumbled.
I know you didn't,
the tech rebutted simply.